was a journey that would change the course of history forever. A story of ambition, bloodshed, and one man's relentless pursuit of glory. Hernán Cortés, a name forever etched in the annals of both Spanish and Aztec history, did what few dared to imagine. He brought down one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, with little more than a handful of soldiers, a few cannons, and a dangerous alliance forged in treachery. His life, a tangled web of bravery, cunning, and ruthless ambition, unfolded against the backdrop of a world on the brink of unimaginable change. Today, we're diving deep into the life of Hernán Cortés, a man whose daring conquest of the Aztec Empire reshaped the fate of 2 continents. Cortés' actions didn't just mark the rise of Spain's power in the New World. They reverberated across the globe, shifting political power and cultural landscapes in ways still felt today, with insights from first-hand accounts like Bernal Diaz del Castillo's The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, and Cortés' own Letters from Mexico, will peel back the layers of his story, revealing both the triumphs and the darkness. Before we embark on this incredible journey, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a deep dive like this one. I'd also love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to comment down below with your ideas for future videos. Now, to understand the force behind the conquest, we need to step back to where it all began. Cortés' early years, his education, and the first sparks of ambition that would propel him toward his historic destiny. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in the small town of Medellin, nestled within the rugged landscapes of Spain's Extremadura region. Though the town was unremarkable, the era was anything but. Spain was at the cusp of greatness, with newly unified kingdoms and dreams of expanding influence beyond the Atlantic. Cortés was born into a family of modest nobility, just enough rank to hold aspirations, but lacking the wealth to fulfill them. His parents, Martin Cortés de Monroy and Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, pinned their hopes on young Hernan becoming a lawyer, someone who could elevate the family's fortunes through prestige rather than conquest. But Cortés was never meant for the confines of legal halls. From an early age, Cortés showed intelligence and ambition that went beyond his family's expectations. At 14, he was sent to the University of Salamanca, one of the most prestigious institutions in Spain. Here, Cortés was exposed to Latin, law, and the study of humanism, the bedrock of a classical education meant to prepare him for a legal career. He was learning the art of persuasion, the subtleties of diplomacy, and the foundations of law, all of which would later serve him well. But despite his academic prowess, Cortés was restless. The pull of adventure and the promise of riches in the newly discovered lands across the ocean tugged at him more powerfully than any desire for legal prestige. The New World was calling, and Cortés wasn't the kind of man to ignore such a call. Tales of explorers like Christopher Columbus and the fortunes to be made across the sea filled his imagination, painting adventure and riches, and to serve God and my king. It was a sentiment shared by many men of his time, but few would come to embody it so completely. At 19, Cortes made the decision that would set him on the path to immortality. He abandoned his studies and left Spain, seeking his fortune in the New World. This was not a choice made lightly, as it went against his family's wishes, particularly his father's dreams of seeing his son ascend the ranks of the legal profession. But Cortes's determination was ironclad. In 1504, he set sail for Hispaniola, the gateway to the Americas, with nothing more than his wit, ambition, and a heart full of dreams. The voyage was treacherous, but for Cortes, it was a baptism into the life of an explorer. The glittering promise of the New World was intoxicating, and Cortes arrived with a hunger not just for wealth, but for the power and glory that could come with it. His education had taught him how to navigate Spanish society, but it was his unquenchable thirst for adventure that propelled him towards something far greater. With the shores of the New World now in sight, Cortes was poised to embark on a series of expeditions that would forever change the fate of 2 continents. His early ventures were just the beginning, laying the foundation for his boldest and most infamous journey, the conquest of the mighty Aztec Empire. In 1504, a young Hernán Cortés stepped onto the sun-soaked shores of Hispaniola, the gateway to the New World, with nothing but ambition in his heart and the desire for adventure burning in his chest. Fresh from the intellectual halls of Salamanca, Cortés left behind the life of a scholar and embraced the unknown. Hispaniola, the first Spanish colony in the Americas, was bustling with opportunity, and Cortés was quick to find his place within it. His first role was as a notary, a position that placed him close to power, but Cortés's ambitions ran far deeper than legal paperwork and colonial bureaucracy. His sharp mind and keen political instincts were already at work, laying the foundation for his rise. After 7 years of navigating the complexities of colonial society, the next chapter of Cortés's journey began in 1511, when he joined Diego Velázquez in the conquest of Cuba. Velázquez, a seasoned conquistador himself, recognized something in Cortés, a mix of cunning and charisma that made him invaluable. Together, they led Spanish forces across the island, subduing native resistance and establishing Spanish rule. Cortés, always quick to seize an opportunity, played a critical role in the campaign, earning both Velázquez's trust and the spoils of conquest. The fertile lands of Cuba became a proving ground for Cortés, a place where his ambition began to take on a more focused shape. By the time the island was firmly under Spanish control, Cortés had manoeuvred himself into a position of influence. He wasn't just a soldier or an adventurer anymore. His political savvy had gained him the favour of Velázquez, who rewarded him with the title of Mayor of Santiago de Cuba. It was a prestigious position, one that granted him land, wealth, and authority, but for Cortés, it was still not enough. His mind was already set on grander schemes. He wanted more than Cuba. He dreamed of exploring lands yet untouched by Spanish boots, places that promised not just riches, but the kind of glory that would immortalize Cortes's ambitions for further exploration, however, soon brought him into conflict with Velasquez. The governor of Cuba had his own plans for future expeditions, and while Cortes had won his favour in the past, Velasquez began to see the young conquistador's growing influence as a threat. Tensions simmered beneath the surface as Cortes began pushing for more autonomy, more control over his fate. The friction between the two men only grew as Cortes made no secret of his hunger for something greater. As Cortes himself once said, "In order to do great things, a man must not hesitate when the opportunity presents itself." The opportunity Cortes sought was conquest, an expedition to the mainland, where rumours of vast empires and unimaginable wealth had begun to circulate among the Spanish settlers. For Cortes, this was the chance he had been waiting for, a chance to carve his name into history. But Velasquez, sensing the threat that Cortes posed to his own power, hesitated. He had trusted Cortes once, but now he saw a rival in the making. Their relationship, once built on mutual gain, now teetered on the edge of betrayal. Cortes, ever the strategist, knew that if he waited for Velasquez's blessing, the opportunity might pass him by. He began gathering ships and men in secret, preparing for an expedition that would take him beyond the islands and into the heart of the Americas. Velasquez, suspicious of Cortes's intentions, attempted to revoke his command at the last minute, but Cortes was already one step ahead. By the time the governor's orders reached him, Cortes had set sail, defying his former ally and launching himself toward a destiny far grander than either of them could have imagined. As Cortes's ships cut through the waves, the mainland of Mexico came into view. It was a land of towering temples, rich cultures, and powerful empires, the kind of place where a man could make his mark on the world forever. In 1518, the winds of fate began to shift. Diego Velasquez, now governor of Cuba, had long dreamed of pushing deeper into the unknown lands of Mexico. He commissioned an expedition, one intended to explore and potentially conquer these mysterious territories. But when it came to choosing a leader for such an ambitious venture, Velasquez hesitated. He knew Cortes was capable, but he also feared his growing ambition. Cortes, sensing the hesitation, made a bold move. In a daring act of defiance, he seized control of the expedition, defying Velasquez's orders. With 11 ships, 500 men, 16 horses, and a vision that would change the world, Cortes set sail toward Mexico, the land of legend. The sea journey was treacherous, but Cortes and his men were undeterred. They landed on the island of Cozumel, a small outpost in the Yucatan Peninsula, where they made their first contact with the indigenous peoples. These early encounters were marked by a mixture of awe and suspicion. The Spaniards, with their horses, metal weapons, and unfamiliar clothing, appeared like gods to some and invaders to others. Cortes, ever the diplomat, knew that success would depend on forging alliances. He quickly made it clear that he sought to dominate, but he also understood the value of local knowledge. As they journeyed deeper into the Yucatan, Cortes's fortunes took an unexpected turn. He encountered a woman who had become most crucial figures in his conquest, La Malinche, known to her people as Malintzin, a native woman who had been enslaved by the Maya. Malintzin spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Maya. She quickly became Cortes' translator, but her role was far more significant than that. Malintzin was not only a linguistic bridge, she was an advisor, a strategist, and a cultural interpreter. She understood the complexities of indigenous politics and used her knowledge to guide Cortes through the maze of alliances and rivalries that dominated the region. Without her, Cortes would have been blind to the intricate dynamics of the people he sought to conquer. As the conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo later wrote, without Malintzin, the conquest of Mexico would have been impossible. With Malintzin by his side, Cortes began to form alliances with native groups who were disgruntled by the heavy hand of Aztec rule. These tribes, resentful of the tributes and sacrifices demanded by the Aztec Empire, saw in Cortes a potential liberator, though they could not have imagined the true nature of Spanish intentions. Cortes, ever the manipulator, played these rivalries to his advantage. He promised freedom from the oppressive rule of the Aztecs, and one by one, these groups began to ally themselves with the Spanish forces. It was a masterful political move, one that would give Cortes the strength he needed to face the vast and powerful empire of Tenochtitlan. By the time Cortes' fleet reached the mainland, he had already begun to weave a network of alliances that would serve him well in the coming months. The land before him was vast, filled with mountains, jungles, and towering cities, the likes of which no European had ever seen. It was both awe-inspiring and dangerous, a world teeming with possibilities and with enemies. As the ships docked on the coast near what would later become Veracruz, Cortes knew that the true test was yet to come. The alliances he had formed were fragile, held together by promises and shared hatred for the Aztecs. Now, he and his men would have to march inland toward the heart of the empire, toward Tenochtitlan. The path ahead would be filled with challenges, but for Cortes, turning back was not an option. The march to the great Aztec capital had begun, and with it, the final chapter of his audacious conquest. The march to Tenochtitlan was nothing short of legendary. Hernán Cortés, leading a band of a few hundred Spanish soldiers, found himself in a world where cities floated on water, temples reached toward the heavens, and empires rose and fell with a single word. But his journey to the heart of the Aztec Empire wasn't just about the strength of Spanish steel. It was a masterclass in manipulation, diplomacy, and sheer ruthlessness. Cortés knew that his small force, however well armed, could never take on the mighty Aztecs alone. He needed allies, and he found them among the Totonacs and the Tlaxcalans, two peoples who had long suffered under the heavy hand of Aztec domination. The Totonacs, who resided on the eastern coast of Mexico, were the first to join his cause. They were eager to throw off the yoke of tribute and sacrifice that the Aztecs demanded. Cortés, ever the strategist, seized the opportunity. He promised them freedom, knowing full well that their alliance would give him the strength to march inland. But it was the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who had long resisted Aztec rule, who proved to be Cortes' most valuable allies. After a series of brutal skirmishes in which the Spaniards narrowly avoided disaster, Cortes managed to win over the Tlaxcalan leaders. They too sought to overthrow the Aztec Empire, and their armies would soon march alongside the Spanish, providing crucial numbers and local knowledge. With these alliances secured, Cortes was no longer just a rogue conquistador. He was now the leader of a formidable coalition bent on the destruction of Tenochtitlan. As they moved closer to the Aztec capital, the city of Cholula came into view. It was here that Cortes demonstrated the kind of ruthless military tactics that would forever define his conquest. Cholula, a religious centre allied with the Aztecs, welcomed Cortes and his men. But behind the scenes, Cortes received intelligence, likely through his trusted interpreter, Malintzin, that a plot was being hatched to ambush the Spaniards. Rather than wait for an attack, Cortes struck first. In a shocking display of brutality, his men slaughtered thousands of unarmed Cholulans, sending a clear message to anyone who might dare to resist him. The massacre at Cholula was a turning point. Word of Cortes's ruthlessness spread like wildfire, and when he finally approached the gates of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs knew they were not dealing with a typical band of invaders. Yet, rather than meeting them with force, the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II, chose a different path. He sent emissaries bearing gifts of gold and finery, hoping to pacify these strange newcomers. But the gifts only inflamed Cortes' ambitions. On November 8th, 1519, Hernán Cortés and his army crossed the causeways into Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Aztec Empire. As they neared the city, they were greeted by Moctezuma himself. The emperor, adorned in brilliant robes and surrounded by his retinue, extended an invitation for Cortes and his men to enter the city. It was a decision that would alter the fate of his empire forever. For the Spaniards, Tenochtitlan was unlike anything they had ever seen. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, the city seemed to float on the water. Canals crisscrossed the streets, and stone causeways connected the city to the mainland. Cortes marvelled at the sight of towering temples, bustling marketplaces, and grand palaces. This was the greatest city I had ever seen, Cortes later wrote, far surpassing anything in Spain. The marketplaces alone were staggering in their size, filled with goods from across the empire, jewels, textiles, exotic foods, and more. Moctezuma, for his part, welcomed the Spaniards with open arms. He housed them in one of his own palaces, providing them with food, gifts, and every luxury they could imagine. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Moctezuma was no fool. He knew the arrival of the Spaniards was a sign of greater troubles to come. The Aztec priests warned of omens, strange signs in the skies that foretold doom. Yet Moctezuma seemed caught between two worlds, one of divine prophecy and one of political reality. By inviting Cortes into his city, he hoped to understand these foreign invaders and perhaps use them to strengthen his own rule. But it would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Cortes, while inside the city walls, he was poised to strike at the very heart of Aztec power. The uneasy hospitality between the two leaders would not last long. Cortes had come to Mexico for conquest, and Montezuma's generosity would not sway him from his goal. The Spaniards marvelled at the wealth and beauty of Tenochtitlan, but they were soldiers, not tourists. For Cortes, the true prize was yet to be taken. Tensions were rising, and the once gilded welcome was quickly turning into a perilous standoff. Cortes knew the time for diplomacy was running out, and soon he would have to make his move. The fall of Tenochtitlan was on the horizon, and with it, the end of one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. Tensions in Tenochtitlan simmered beneath the surface like a volcano waiting to erupt. Hernán Cortés, ever the master tactician, recognized the precariousness of his position. Despite Montezuma's lavish hospitality, Cortés knew that the emperor's goodwill would not last forever. The longer he and his men remained in the city, the more dangerous their situation became. The Aztec people, once awed by the Spaniards, began to grow restless. Whispers of rebellion circulated through the streets, and the once admired guests quickly became despised intruders. In a bold and unprecedented move, Cortés acted to secure his control. He took Montezuma hostage, holding the emperor as a puppet within his own palace. With Montezuma in his grasp, Cortés believed he could prevent an uprising, using the emperor's authority to command obedience from the Aztec nobility. It was a high-stakes gamble, and for a time it worked. The Aztecs remained outwardly submissive, but Cortés could feel the undercurrents of rebellion swirling just beneath the surface. However, events took a dramatic turn when word reached Cortés that Panfilo de Narvaez, a Spanish officer sent by Diego Velázquez, had arrived on the coast with a force of over 1,000 men. Velázquez, furious with Cortés' defiance, had ordered Narvaez to arrest him and bring him back to Cuba in chains. For most men, this news would have been a death sentence, but Cortés saw it as an opportunity. Leaving a small garrison in Tenochtitlan, he marched to meet Narvaez with only a fraction of his forces. In one of the most audacious moves of his career, Cortés ambushed Narvaez's larger army under the cover of night. The attack was swift and decisive. Narvaez, caught off guard, was quickly captured, and his men, impressed by Cortés's leadership, chose to join him rather than fight. Cortés had not only neutralized the threat, but had also significantly bolstered his own army. With Narvaez's soldiers now at his command, Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan stronger than ever. But upon his return, the city was on the brink of chaos. The situation had spiraled out of control. Montezuma, once revered by his people, was now seen as a weak figurehead, a puppet of the Spanish invaders. In a desperate attempt to quell the growing unrest, Cortés forced Montezuma to address his people from the palace walls, urging them to maintain peace. But instead of calming the crowd, the emperor's words only fueled their rage. Stones and spears flew through the air, and in the chaos that followed, Montezuma was struck down by his own people. His death marked the had turned into a deadly maze filled with angry Aztec warriors. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards attempted a desperate escape from the city. Laden with stolen gold and treasures, they tried to sneak across the causeways that connected the city to the mainland. But the Aztecs were waiting. In what would come to be known as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, Cortes and his men were ambushed as they fled. The narrow causeways became death traps, with Aztec warriors attacking from canoes and bridges. Hundreds of Spaniards were killed, their bodies sinking into the dark waters of Lake Texcoco. Only a battered remnant of Cortes' army made it out alive. Despite this devastating defeat, Cortes was not a man to give up easily. Retreating to Tlaxcala, he regrouped with his allies, licking his wounds and plotting his revenge. He spent months rebuilding his forces, gathering more indigenous allies, and preparing for the final assault on Tenochtitlan. This time, he would not rely on a single decisive battle. Instead, he planned a slow and methodical siege that would choke the life out of the great city. In May 1521, Cortes' forces returned to the Valley of Mexico, surrounding Tenochtitlan. The siege began in earnest, and it was nothing short of brutal. Cortes ordered his men to cut off the city's water supplies and block the causeways, trapping the inhabitants inside. Starvation and disease soon followed. Smallpox, brought by the Spanish, spread like wildfire through the densely populated city, decimating the Aztec population. Cortes did not let up. His forces launched relentless attacks, slowly tearing down the city's defences. For 3 long months, the people of Tenochtitlan endured unimaginable suffering. The once great city, with its towering temples and bustling markets, was reduced to a shell of its former glory. The streets were filled with the bodies of the dead and the dying. As Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortes's soldiers, later wrote, "It was a scene of horror. We walked over the bodies of the dead." The conquest was not just a military victory, it was a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. On August 13th, 1521, the final blow was struck. The last of the Aztec resistance crumbled, and the great city of Tenochtitlan fell. The empire that had once ruled over millions was no more. Cortes had achieved the impossible. With a handful of men and the support of indigenous allies, he had toppled one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. The Aztec Emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured, and the last vestiges of Aztec sovereignty were wiped away. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of a new era. The Spanish now had a foothold in the Americas, and from the ashes of Tenochtitlan, a new city would rise, Mexico City, the capital of Spain's vast colonial empire in the New World. Cortes had not only secured his place in history, but had also opened the door for further Spanish conquests across the continent. Yet, for Cortes, the victory came with its own costs. The battles had left scars, both physical and emotional, on the man who had led the charge. The horrors of the siege, the loss of countless lives, and the betrayal of those who had trusted him weighed heavily on his soul. But Cortes was not done yet. His ambitions extended his military triumph, Cortes now faced an entirely different challenge, ruling over the vast lands he had conquered and rebuilding a civilization from the ruins of another. The sprawling city of Tenochtitlan, once the dazzling heart of the Aztec Empire, lay in ruins, but in its place, Cortes saw the future. He set out to transform the devastated city into Mexico City, the shining capital of New Spain, and the first European foothold in the Americas. Rebuilding Tenochtitlan was no easy task. Cortes oversaw the construction of new roads, plazas, and cathedrals, incorporating European architectural styles while repurposing the rubble of the once great Aztec city. The canals that once crisscrossed the city were filled in, and slowly Tenochtitlan's former glory gave way to a new vision of Spanish dominance. Cortes had won the war, but governing was a different kind of battle. He sought to implement Spanish rule, establishing the legal, social, and economic structures necessary to turn his conquest into a functioning colony. But for all his success on the battlefield, Cortes's governance was fraught with difficulties. Political rivalries festered, both among the indigenous populations and within the Spanish ranks. Uprisings erupted as indigenous groups resisted the harsh new colonial rule, and the encomienda system, Spain's brutal method of exploiting native labour, only deepened the divide between conqueror and conquered. Cortes himself was instrumental in introducing this system to New Spain, granting large tracts of land to Spanish settlers, along with the right to force indigenous peoples into labour. It was a system that benefited the Spanish elite while devastating the native population. Disease, overwork, and harsh conditions ravaged the indigenous people, and what was once a thriving culture was reduced to mere survival under the weight of colonial exploitation. Despite his personal charisma and his success as a military leader, Cortes faced growing resentment from both the indigenous population and Spanish officials. Many within his own ranks viewed him with suspicion, fearful of his growing power and wealth. Cortes, ever the pragmatist, wrote to the Spanish crown, assuring King Charles V that his ambitions were not personal, but for the glory of Spain. I am not interested in gold for myself, but for my king and for the glory of Spain, he claimed. Though the reality was far more complex, gold, power, and influence were indeed at the heart of his rule. As governor, Cortes had to navigate a political landscape filled with intrigue and betrayal. Spanish officials in the New World, jealous of his success and suspicious of his ambitions, began to plot against him. They accused him of abusing his power, mishandling resources, and acting in his own self-interest rather than that of Spain. Cortes found himself fighting not only against the indigenous uprisings, but also against his own countrymen. Despite his attempts to consolidate his power, political enemies continued to undermine him. In 1528, Cortes' enemies succeeded in having him recalled to Spain. It was a humiliating blow. Stripped of his title as governor, he faced accusations of mismanagement and corruption. His political enemies in the court of King Charles V had worked tirelessly to bring him down. once the unrivaled conqueror of Mexico, found himself at the mercy of bureaucratic rivalries. He spent years defending his legacy, petitioning the crown to restore his titles and clear his name. Though he was eventually reinstated as Captain General and allowed to return to Mexico, the governorship was lost to him forever. Upon his return to New Spain, Cortes was a shadow of his former self in terms of political power. His ambitions to further expand the Spanish Empire met with limited success, as other conquistadors had risen to prominence in his absence. Despite his diminished role, Cortes continued to involve himself in the administration of the colony, though always under the watchful eye of his political enemies. His dream of ruling a vast empire in the New World was slipping away. As his political power waned, Cortes began to focus on his legacy, attempting to preserve his place in history as the man who conquered the mighty Aztec Empire. Yet, despite his fall from grace in the political arena, Cortes' influence on New Spain was undeniable. He had not only destroyed an empire, but had also laid the foundations of a new one, even if the price had been paid with the suffering of thousands. With his dreams of governance behind him, Cortes now turned his gaze toward the twilight of his life, where questions of legacy and redemption would linger in his mind. But as the shadows of his past caught up with him, Cortes would have to reckon with the costs of his ambition, both to the indigenous peoples of Mexico and to his own soul. As the years passed, Hernán Cortés found himself increasingly isolated from the power he had once wielded so effortlessly. His meteoric rise as the conqueror of the Aztec Empire was followed by an equally dramatic fall from grace. Stripped of his governorship, and with his political influence in New Spain eroded, Cortés spent his later years fighting to restore his reputation. In the court of Spain, where alliances shifted as easily as sand, Cortés's enemies worked tirelessly to keep him from regaining the control he craved. Returning to Spain, Cortés sought to clear his name and reclaim his lost territories, but the political landscape had changed. He was no longer the daring conquistador who had delivered untold wealth to the crown. Now, he was a man dogged by accusations of corruption, cruelty, and mismanagement. Though he had once been Charles V's favoured servant, Cortés now found himself sidelined. He petitioned the king repeatedly, hoping to regain some of the authority he had lost, but his pleas often fell on deaf ears. The tide had turned, and Spain no longer needed a conqueror. It needed administrators and loyal bureaucrats. Cortés was neither. Yet, even in his twilight years, the spirit of exploration still burned within him. In 1524, he embarked on an ill-fated expedition to Honduras, hoping to extend Spain's influence in Central America. The journey was fraught with hardship, treachery, and disease. While Cortés succeeded in quelling rebellions and reasserting some semblance of order, the expedition did little to restore his standing in the eyes of the crown. It seemed that no matter how far he ventured, or how many lands he claimed, his legacy was slipping from his grasp. Still determined to prove his worth, Cortés turned his attention to the Pacific. He financed and led explorations along the Pacific coast of Mexico, hoping shores of what is now Baja California, Cortés was unable to find the kind of success that had defined his earlier years. By the time Cortés returned to Spain for the final time, he was a man out of step with his own legend. In 1541, he was granted the rare honour of joining Charles V on an expedition to Algiers, but the venture ended in disaster, further tarnishing his reputation. His once prominent role in the New World had been eclipsed by younger, more politically astute figures, and Cortés found himself struggling to navigate the murky waters of Spanish court politics. In 1547, Hernán Cortés died quietly in Castilleja de la Cuesta, near Seville, far from the lands he had conquered and the empire he had forged. He was 62 years old. For all his accomplishments, Cortés died a man without the power or recognition he had once commanded. His death marked the end of an era, but the debate over his legacy was just beginning. Cortés left behind a legacy that was as complex as it was controversial. To some, he was the embodiment of Spain's glory, a man who had braved the unknown, toppled an empire, and claimed vast riches for the crown. His conquest of the Aztec Empire was seen as a defining moment in the expansion of European power, and his daring leadership earned him a place in the annals of history. As Cortés himself wrote in his letters, "I have done what I came to do, and history will judge me." Yet to others, Cortés was the very symbol of Spain's brutality and greed in the New World. His conquest was marked by acts of extreme violence, treachery, and exploitation. The devastation he wrought upon the Aztec civilization and the indigenous peoples of Mexico was profound, and the encomienda system he helped implement left a lasting scar on the region. Disease, warfare, and forced labour decimated entire populations, and Cortés' role in this destruction cannot be ignored. His pursuit of power and wealth, while successful, came at an enormous human cost. In the centuries following his death, historians have wrestled with the question: was Hernán Cortés a courageous explorer or a ruthless conqueror? The answer is not simple. He was both a visionary and a man of his time, driven by the ambitions that shaped the age of exploration. His achievements were extraordinary, but so too were the consequences of his actions. He opened the door for Spain's dominance in the Americas, but he also set in motion the collapse of indigenous cultures that had flourished for centuries. In Mexico, Cortés is remembered with a mixture of awe and disdain. His name is both revered and reviled, a symbol of the birth of a new nation and the destruction of an old one. His impact on world history is undeniable. He was one of the architects of the modern age, bridging two worlds and forever changing the course of both. As the legacy of Hernán Cortés continues to be debated, his life stands as a reminder of the complexities of history. He was a man who saw an opportunity and seized it, a conqueror who reshaped the world in his image. Yet, as his story fades into the annals of time, it is clear that his legacy, like the man himself, will remain a topic of fierce discussion for generations to come. While the debate over his accomplishments continues, it is impossible to ignore the controversies that surround him. Cortés' legacy is forever entwined with the darker side of his conquests, the exploitation, the violence, and the destruction. Hernán Cortés remains one of history's most polarizing figures. On the one hand, he is celebrated as a brilliant military strategist and a daring explorer, a man who defied the odds to conquer one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. On the other, he is condemned as a brutal invader whose actions brought unimaginable suffering to the indigenous peoples of Mexico. The moral debate over Cortés' legacy is as fierce today as it was in the centuries following his conquest of the Aztecs. For some, Cortés was a military genius. His ability to manipulate alliances, his audacious decision to march on Tenochtitlan with only a small band of soldiers, and his skill in turning indigenous factions against one another demonstrated tactical brilliance. In his letters, Cortés portrayed himself as a servant of the Spanish crown, seeking to expand the glory of Spain and spread Christianity. His defenders argued that he did what was necessary to achieve his goals in an age when conquest and expansion were the hallmarks of European power. However, this version of events overlooks the brutality that marked his campaign. Cortés's conquest was not a series of heroic battles. It was a campaign of calculated violence. The massacre at Cholula, where he slaughtered thousands of unarmed indigenous people to send a message, is just one example of his ruthless methods. He wielded terror as a weapon, using it to cow indigenous populations into submission. As much as he was a brilliant tactician, Cortés was also a man who saw no moral limits to achieving his aims. To many, he was not a hero, but a conqueror driven by greed and ambition, willing to destroy entire civilizations for the promise of gold and glory. Yet, even Cortés' most ardent critics must contend with a factor beyond his control: disease. The fall of the Aztec Empire cannot be attributed to military might alone. When Cortés and his men arrived in Mexico, they brought with them invisible enemies, smallpox, measles, and other European diseases that the indigenous population had never encountered. These diseases ravaged the Aztecs, weakening them far more than Spanish steel ever could. Smallpox, in particular, swept through the empire like wildfire, decimating villages and killing indiscriminately. It is estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population perished in the years following the Spanish conquest, not from battle, but from disease. As historian Matthew Restall remarked, Cortés did not conquer Mexico. Disease and discord among the native peoples did. The role of disease raises a complex question. To what extent was Cortés responsible for the devastation of the Aztec Empire? He could not have foreseen the biological catastrophe that would unfold, but he did capitalize on it. As smallpox spread, Cortés intensified his efforts, knowing that his weakened enemies could not resist his advances. In this sense, the conquest was as much a product of timing as it was of military strategy. The Aztecs, already divided and vulnerable, stood little chance against the combined force of European diseases and Spanish weapons. Beyond the immediate toll of conquest, the Spanish invasion everlasting consequences for the indigenous peoples of Mexico. The encomienda system, which Cortes helped establish, enslaved countless natives, forcing them to work under brutal conditions for Spanish landowners. The indigenous way of life, with its rich traditions, languages, and religious practices, was systematically erased. The Spaniards imposed Christianity upon the conquered, often violently, burning temples and idols, and executing those who resisted conversion. The cultural legacy of the Aztecs, so vibrant and complex, was buried under the weight of Spanish domination. The indigenous population did not simply vanish, but their world was irrevocably changed. Their land, once governed by powerful city-states, was now divided and controlled by foreign invaders. Their religion, which had shaped their daily lives and their worldview, was replaced by a foreign faith. Even their language and customs were slowly supplanted by those of the Spanish. What the sword did not destroy, disease and colonial policies finished. In the wake of Cortes' conquest, the indigenous peoples of Mexico found themselves living in a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. These actions have cast a long shadow over Cortes' legacy. While he may have been a man of his time, when conquest was seen as a divine right and the spread of Christianity was seen as a moral duty, modern eyes view his actions through a different lens. Was he a courageous leader who seized the opportunity to bring a new world under European rule, or was he a ruthless conqueror who obliterated an entire culture in pursuit of wealth and power? The truth lies somewhere in between. Cortes himself seemed to understand the complexity of his legacy. In his later years he wrote, "I have done what I came to do, and history will judge me." He recognized that his actions would be scrutinized, not just in his lifetime, but for generations to come. And indeed, history has judged him, often harshly. Yet, it is impossible to consider Cortes without acknowledging the broader forces at play. His conquest of the Aztecs was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of European expansion that reshaped the globe. His actions mirrored those of other conquistadors, explorers, and colonial administrators who believed in their divine right to claim new lands, regardless of the cost to the people who lived there. Cortes was not unique in his ambition or his brutality, but he has become one of the most enduring symbols of the consequences of that ambition. As we reflect on his life, we are left with more questions than answers. Cortes remains a figure of controversy, a man who embodied both the triumphs and the tragedies of an age defined by exploration and conquest. His legacy, like the empire he destroyed, is built on contradictions, brilliance and brutality, glory and ruin. But even as the debate over Cortes continues, we must confront the fact that his legacy is also a reflection of the time in which he lived, a time when the world was changing and when the collision of cultures would forever reshape history. Hernán Cortés remains one of the most complex figures in history, a man whose daring changed the fate of 2 continents. From his bold march into the heart of the Aztec Empire to the brutal tactics he employed to bring it to its knees, Cortés played a pivotal role in shaping the future of the Americas. His conquest of Mexico opened the door for centuries of Spanish domination in the New triumph and tragedy, a reminder of the complex forces that drive human ambition. The world he created was one where cultures collided, empires fell, and new ones were born, often at a terrible cost. The impact of the Spanish conquest continues to be felt today. The indigenous cultures of the Americas were forever changed, their lands, religions, and traditions disrupted. Cortes's legacy is not just his victory over the Aztecs, it is the reshaping of an entire hemisphere. If you enjoyed this exploration of Hernán Cortés and his legacy, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts or suggestions for future videos. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and until next time, sleep well.